He sat alone in the far corner of Crestfield Avenue, a creaky manual wheelchair with weather-worn rubber grips and rust clinging to the spokes. His coat was navy blue, military issue from another generation. It hung on his frame like a wrinkled, but still unmistakably proud. No ribbons, no name patch, just a man and his silence. The morning air in Halbrook was cool, tinged with the smell of dew-covered grass and the distant sweetness of funnel cake being prepped near the town square. It was Memorial Day. The streets were slowly filling with lawn chairs, strollers, plastic flags in tiny hands. Local vendors wheeled out coolers and folding tables. Families laughed, children weaved between adult legs, and speakers crackled with patriotic music that no one really listened. Told you, everyone. Expected. Nobody noticed the old man at first. Some passed by and nodded politely. Most didn't look twice. He didn't seem to mind. His eyes remained fixed on the far end of the street, where the parade would soon begin. He had claimed his spot before sunrise. He hadn't asked permission. He didn't need to. His name was Howard R. Finch. If you lived in Halbrook, you probably knew the name, but only if you read the old plaques in the town's veterans. Hall or remembered the framed photograph at the diner showing a young man in uniform beside a fighter plane, grinning like a boy about to take on the world, but time is cruel to memory. Now he was just the quiet old man in the White House with the cracked paint and the American flag always at half-mast. He lived alone, no wife, no kids, just a mutt named Ranger and a shelf full of dust-covered history. What no one knew was that this Memorial Day Paraduus, the last thing on his list. The doctors had told him 6 weeks, maybe 8 if he agreed to the treatment. Howard refused. "I've had enough battles," he told them. "This one, I'll let it win." Instead, he asked his neighbor's son Danny, the high school junior who mowed his lawn, to help him clean his uniform. The sleeves were a little loose now, the buttons hard to close, but Danny helped. No questions, just quiet respect. "You going to the parade, Mr. Finch?" Danny had asked, lacing up the man's old boots. "I've been to more than I can count," Howard replied. "But this one's different." He didn't explain. He didn't need to. This morning, Danny had wheeled him down the sidewalk in silence, past the bakery, the post office, and the bronze statue of Halbrook's WWI, dead. When they reached the curb near the corner, Howard had tapped the brakes on his chair and simply said, "Here." Then Danny left, as instructed, though he didn't really want to. He looked back once. Howard didn't wave. Now, hours later, the crowd had swelled. Children in redwood-tan blue face paint buzzed past in bursts of sugar and freedom. Mothers fixed hair ribbons. Fathers tested their phones for the best angle. Teenagers, impatient, looked at their watches. Somewhere, a marching band tuned its instruments. But Howard just waited, still focused, like he was back on the tarmac, waiting for wheels-up clearance. No one knew what he was thinking. No one asked. But inside his mind, he was back there, again July 3rd, 1952, a scorching runway. In Okinawa, engines humming, orders in his breast pocket, 23 years old, 5 days into his first command. A mission that would take half his squadron into the unknown, only bring half of them back. He remembered the screaming metal, the smoke, the way his co-pilot never made a sound after the second hit, the smell of fuel, the impossible silence afterward. And he remembered the promise he made while dragging his crew out of the wreckage. A whisper to no one in particular. "If I walk away from this, I'll remember every single one who didn't." He had kept that promise. Every Memorial Day since, even when his body failed, even when the names began to blur, even when he started forgetting what he had for breakfast, but never the sound of a man's last breath beside him. And so, here he was, alone but not unaccompanied. Because ghosts don't leave men like Howard, they sit beside them. Silently, with dignity, at exactly 11:59 a.m. The first rumble of the parade reached the corner. A sheriff's vehicle crept down the road, its lights flashing gently. Behind it, a fleet of fire trucks. Then the high school marching band, a bit out of tune, but full of heart. Floats followed, some with veterans tossing candy, others with Cub Scouts waving handmade banners. The crowd clapped. Children cheered. Phones were raised. Howard didn't move, but his eyes tracked every boot, every flag, every pair of white gloves. He nodded once when the ROTC kids passed by. Then the sound changed. The boots were louder now, sharper, in sync like thunder. It was the Marines, 47 of them, in full dress blues, marching with absolute precision, eyes forward, arms swinging, faces set like granite dot. They were from the 7th Company out of Fort Branton part of the national rotation. They didn't know Halbrook, didn't know Howard, or so it seemed, because just as they approached the bend where Howard sat alone at the edge of the crowd, something happened. The formation slowed, then stopped, and from the head of the unit, a tall, imposing man stepped out, silver at his temples, 3 rows of ribbons on his chest. A colonel. He broke formation and walked across the street, right toward the man in the wheelchair. The Marine colonel's boots struck the pavement with steady, deliberate steps as he crossed the street, parting the crowd without needing to say a word. The town had fallen still, not out of confusion, but reverence. The band stopped. The clapping stopped. Even the wind seemed to pause. Howard Finch looked up, squinting against the sunlight. The figure walking toward him was unfamiliar at first, clean-shaven, chest broad with decades of command in every step. But there was something in his posture, something in the jawline, a shadow of someone he had once known. The colonel stopped in front of him, standing at full attention. "Staff Sergeant Howard Finch," the man said clearly, his voice crisp but full of emotion. "Permission to speak, sir." Howard's brow furrowed. "Who's asking?" The man's mouth turned slightly at the cornernit, quite a smile. "Colonel Jonathan Evers, son of Sergeant Major Richard Evers, Charlie Company, Korea, 1952. Howard's hands trembled slightly on the arms of the wheelchair. "Richie Evers," he whispered. "That kid with the crooked salute and the comic books in his rucksack?" The colonel nodded once. "That was him. He passed 10 years ago. But he talked about you until the day he died. Said you were the reason he made it out. That when his leg was torn up and the hill was overrun, you carried him on your back 3 miles through the dark." Howard blinked slowly, eyes suddenly glassy. "I remember that night. I told him to drop the radio. He refused. Said we couldn't lose. Comes Colonel Evers." Inhaled deeply. He never forgot. Neither did we. Then, without hesitation, he turned to face his Marines and raised a hand-sharp commanding company. Halt! The synchronized stomp of 47 boots froze in perfect unison. Evers turned back toward Howard. "This man," he said, loud enough for everyone along the street to hear, "was never awarded a medal, never gave a speech, never stood on a podium. But men like my father came home because he never left them behind." A murmur spread. People leaned forward. Mothers hushed children. Several in the crowd lowered their phones, suddenly too ashamed. "To film what felt sacred, we march under his name," the colonel continued, voice thickening. "He didn't know that until today." Howard's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Only breath, only memory, only the crushing weight of something he'd never expected to return. Honor Colonel Evers turned again. Company fallout, one by one. And what happened next would live in Halbrook's collective memory forever. Each Marine, from the youngest private to the weathered first sergeant, stepped out of formation. One by one, they approached Howard Finch, and each time they stopped, saluted, looked him in the eye, and said 2 words. "Thank you." Private salute. "Thank you, Sergeant." Corporal salute. "Thank you, sir." Gunnery Sergeant salute. "You gave my father a second chance." Howard's hands trembled harder now. He tried to speak, but the words collapsed under the gravity of the moment. Still, he raised his hand with effort, returning each salute. With aching dignity, tears welled up behind old eyes that had seen too much. But these were different tears. These were not from sorrow or memory. These were from something else, from being seen. For the first time in decades, Howard Finch wasn't. Invisible dot off to the side. Daniel had quietly returned after the first band passed stood among the crowd, jaw slack, eyes shining. His mother stood beside him, hand over her heart, not daring to interrupt. "I didn't know," she whispered. "Me neither," Danny said. "He never told me." On the sidewalk, local news reporters fumbled with cameras, but the best angles couldn't capture what mattered. Not really. Not the crack in the colonel's voice. Not the way Howard's fingers brushed a tear from his cheek like it wasn't allowed. not the silence so deep it felt like a collective prayer. The 47th Marine stepped forward. The crowd had shifted. No one was sitting, everyone stood. Children clutched their flags tighter. Veterans in the crowd saluted. One elderly woman lost her husband in Vietnam, lowered her head and whispered something too sacred for anyone else to hear. The last Marine stepped back. Colonel Evers approached one final time. "We've got something for you, Sergeant Finch." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small box. Howard looked down at it, confused. "This," Evers said, opening it gently, "is the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal. We checked the records. You were nominated, but it was lost in the shuffle. You never claimed it." Howard's lips parted. That was over 70 years. "Ego, exactly," Evers said, "and we're late, but not too late." He bent down, and with all the ceremony of Arlington itself, pinned the medal to Howard's jacket right over his heart. "On behalf of the United States Marine Corps, welcome home." The crowd erupted not in applause, but in reverent silence. Then one man clapped, then another. Then the entire town of Halbrook broke into thunderous, unrestrained, heartfelt applause. People weren't just clapping for a veteran. They were clapping for decades of silence being broken, for dignity restored, for all the Howards who sit alone, wondering if anyone remembers. The applause faded slowly, not because people grew tired, but because something about it felt too big for clapping. The crowd stood motionless for a moment, absorbing what they had just witnessed, not a performance, not a ceremony, something purer, older, sacred. Howard Finch sat silently, the medal now resting gently over his heart. His hands had stopped shaking. His breath was steady. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't crying, he was just still. For the first time in decades, he wasn't just a man in a chair at a parade. He was someone whose story had been brought back into the light. Colonel Evers leaned down once more. "We'll see you soon, Sergeant," he said quietly. "You're family now. Always were." Howard gave the smallest of nods. "Tell your father I didn't forget." "I know," Evers replied, blinking hard. "He never did either." Then the colonel straightened, turned back to the road, and barked, "Compline reform." The Marines returned to formation, boots crisp against the pavement, rifles glinting. In the noon sun, when they marched again, they didn't need music. The rhythm of their steps was enough. No cheering followed, just silence, and somehow, that silence was louder than anything the town had ever heard. The rest of the parade went on, but everyone knew the heart of it had already passed. After the floats rolled by, after the scouts handed out their last flags, after the band played its closing tune, the crowd lingered. No one was in a hurry anymore. Parents whispered to their kids. Veterans embraced. Strangers introduced themselves by first name and service branch. Danny returned to Howard's side. "You ready to go, sir?" Howard exhaled, long and slow. Not yet. So they waited. Minutes passed. Then the sun shifted. Then, finally, Howard nodded. Back at the house, Danny wheeled him up the walkway. The grass was freshly cut, the porch swept. A flag hung perfectly. Still beside the door, there were no reporters here. No applause, just peace. Inside, the air was quiet, filled with the faint smell of coffee and old paper. Danny helped Howard out of the chair and into his favorite armchair, one that sagged a little but held him like memory. On the side table was an old photo frame. The glass was cracked, the image inside was black and white, slightly faded. It showed a group of young Marines, mud-streaked, exhausted arms slung around each other like brothers. One of them was unmistakably Howard, smiling like he didn't yet understand what war could take. Danny glanced at the frame. Then, at the medal now pinned to Howard's jacket. "You want me to put that in a display case?" Howard shook his head. "No, let it breathe a little." Danny chuckled, unsure if it was a joke. Then he turned to go. But Howard spoke once more. "Thanks for pushing me down there today." Danny paused. "It was an honor, sir," Howard said, eyes heavy now. "The honor was mine. I just didn't know anyone still remembered." "They do now," Danny replied, "because they saw you." Howard leaned back in the chair. His hands rested calmly on his lap. The photo still in sight. The medal close to his heart. The memories gently falling into place. That night, the lights on Howard's porch stayed on. Inside the room was quiet, and by morning, Howard Finch was gone. No pain, no noise, just stillness. He had passed in his sleep, his uniform still neatly folded by the bed. The medal rested on the table beside the old photograph, and on the floor, beside the armchair, sat a folded flag, one he had kept since 1953, one he had once held for someone else. The town awoke to news they didn't expect. Word spread fast, not just through Hellbrook, but through nearby counties, then state headlines, then national ones. A photo of the Marines saluting the old man went viral. The clip of Colonel Evers telling Howard's story reached millions within days. People who had never heard of Hellbrook were now posting thank you messages. Veterans wrote letters. Teachers printed the story to teach in classrooms. Families drove from hours away to lay flowers on Howard's porch. He had never asked to be remembered, but now he would never be forgotten. At his funeral, the chapel overflowed. It wasn't a long service, no grand speeches, no military brass, bandat, just a simple ceremony, and then one final tribute. The same 47 Marines from the parade returned. In full dress uniform, they marched silently, no drums, no commands, down Crestfield Avenue, past the town square, past the post office, past the corner where Howard had sat just days earlier. They stopped in front of his home, turned, and stood at attention. Then together, in perfect unison, they removed their hats and saluted. No words, just honor. The people of Hellbrook followed suit. Children stood tall. Elderly men wiped their eyes, flags lowered gently. And for a moment, the whole town stood as one body still, grateful. Porchlight remained on for weeks after. So did the candles on every doorstep down the block. And then the next block, and then the whole street. It wasn't just mourning, it was gratitude. Howard Finch never made headlines in life. He never collected medals, he never asked for applause, but he lived with integrity, served with courage, and left with dignity. And in the end, that was enough. Enough to move a town, enough to unite strangers, enough to remind a nation that the strongest heroes are often the quietest among us. Before you go, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Hidden Sparks, like the video, and share it with someone who still believes in silent strength, because real heroes don't ask to be noticed. They just show up and leave something behind that lasts forever.